The letter arrived on a morning that felt deliberately ordinary, the kind of day that makes bad news feel sharper by contrast. And it slid halfway out of the mailbox like it was waiting to be noticed, thick paper, aggressive formatting. The HOA's logo stamped at the top in a way that suggested authority rather than service. And I remember standing there longer than necessary, holding it without opening it. Already feeling the familiar pressure behind my eyes that came whenever the association decided it was time to remind residents who they believed really owned the neighborhood. The property itself had always existed in a strange limbo, technically inside the boundary lines of the development, but historically separate from its personality. A remnant of an older layout that predated uniform paint codes and monthly meetings. And from the day I moved in, I understood that the HOA viewed it less as a home and more as a problem that hadn't been solved yet. I had made peace with the low-level harassment, the warning letters over trivial details, the drive-by inspections that lingered too long, the passive-aggressive emails written as if courtesy were an optional feature. But this letter felt different before I even read it, heavier, final in a way that suggested escalation rather than annoyance. When I finally unfolded it, the language was precise and clinical, almost proud of itself, accusing me of unauthorized construction, citing violations that didn't exist, referencing permits I didn't need, and ending with a number that looked absurd until my brain accepted that it was real. A fine totaling $7,500 due immediately or subject to further action. The accusation itself was vague by design, something about unapproved modifications, structural changes, and non-compliance with community standards. But what struck me wasn't confusion, it was certainty, the certainty that they believed they could declare something illegal simply by writing it down. I stood there rereading the lines, looking back toward the property, toward the section of land they claimed I had altered, knowing with absolute clarity that nothing had been built, nothing had been expanded, nothing had changed except their patience. And in that moment it became obvious that the fine wasn't about construction at all. It was about pressure, about forcing a reaction, about seeing whether I would fold or fight. Over the years I had learned that HOAs rarely aimed for truth. They aimed for compliance, and the number wasn't chosen randomly. It was high enough to intimidate but low enough to seem enforceable. A financial shove designed to create panic and silence questions before they could form. Inside the house, the letter sat on the table as I paced, replaying every improvement I had made, every repair, every inch of the property that I had touched with intent to maintain rather than modify. And the more I thought, the more the accusation felt intentional rather than mistaken, a strategic move in a longer game that had been unfolding quietly. The association had been under pressure itself, expanding amenities, renovating shared spaces, increasing dues, and all of it required money. And money required leverage, and leverage required targets, especially targets that were perceived as isolated or non-conforming, and my property checked every box. What they didn't account for was my refusal to react emotionally. The decision I made that afternoon to do the opposite of what they expected, not to argue, not to plead, not to submit documentation they hadn't earned, but to observe, to research, to watch the association's behavior with the same scrutiny they applied to residents. The first thing I noticed was how quickly the fine escalated in their internal language, follow-up notices arriving within days, each one more confident than the last, referencing deadlines and enforcement actions with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, as if the outcome had already been decided and the process was merely a formality. Neighbors began to notice too, not openly, but in the way people do when they sense conflict approaching. Glances held a second longer. Conversations paused when I walked by. The quiet understanding that when the HOA chose a fight, collateral tension spread outward whether anyone wanted it or not. I could feel the association's presence tightening around the property, inspections becoming more frequent, emails sent to entire mailing lists that hinted at rule enforcement and community integrity without naming names, creating an atmosphere where suspicion felt normalized and compliance was framed as virtue. Still, no evidence was provided, no photographs, no diagrams, just authority asserting itself as fact, and that absence became the most telling detail of all. The more I reviewed the letter, the more it read like a template, a form used before, perhaps many times, with details swapped out as needed. And I began to wonder how often this strategy worked. How many residents had paid simply to make the discomfort stop, How many times the association had mistaken silence for guilt and collected without resistance. It was that thought, more than the money, that shifted something internally, turning frustration into focus. Because I realized that this wasn't just about me or my property. It was about a system that thrived on the assumption that no one would look back at it with the same intensity it projected outward. That night I pulled every document related to the property, permits, surveys, historical records, zoning maps, and timelines, spreading them out across the table like a puzzle that had been waiting to be assembled. And as the pieces came together, a pattern began to emerge, not about construction, but about the HOA itself, its office, its authority, and the way it had expanded quietly over time. I noticed discrepancies in dates, approvals that overlapped, renovations mentioned in meeting minutes that didn't align with public records, and it became clear that while the association was aggressively policing imagined violations, it had been far less careful with its own compliance. The office building, the one they operated out of, the one used for meetings, storage, and administrative control, had undergone changes too. Additions, structural modifications, expansions justified internally but never fully reconciled with external requirements. And the irony settled in slowly, not as satisfaction, but as inevitability. By the time I went to sleep, the fine no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an invitation, an opening move that had underestimated its opponent. Because while they believed they were enforcing rules, they had forgotten that rules applied outward and inward equally. And the next step would not be a complaint or a confrontation, but a process, one that would bring in eyes that the HOA had never expected to be turned in its direction. Setting the stage for a reversal that would redefine authority in a way the association was completely unprepared for. And as the night closed in around the house, the story had already moved beyond a fine and into something far more consequential. A shift that would not be loud at first, but would be impossible to ignore once it began. The days following the fine unfolded with a calculated slowness, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening quietly beneath the surface, where assumptions were tested and patterns revealed themselves without the distraction of confrontation. And I found that silence, when used intentionally, made people far more reckless than anger ever could. I did not respond to the HOA's emails or notices, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted to see how quickly authority would turn into impatience when it wasn't acknowledged, and it didn't take long. Within a week, the tone of their correspondence shifted, moving from formal to urgent, from procedural to personal, as if my lack of reaction was being interpreted not as confidence but as defiance, and defiance was something the association believed it had been designed to eliminate. While they escalated on paper, I began moving in the opposite direction, stepping away from assumptions and toward verification, retracing the history of the neighborhood not as it was marketed, but as it actually existed, before branding, before committees, before enforcement became synonymous with governance. The property records painted a picture that felt intentionally blurred in public-facing documents, boundaries drawn in ways that favored expansion, approvals referenced without attached permits, and amendments layered on top of one another, until accountability became difficult to trace. What stood out most was how often the HOA referenced its office as a fixed point of legitimacy, a central authority, a structure so normalized that no one questioned its origins or evolution, and that normalization was precisely what made it vulnerable. I began cross-referencing renovation timelines with municipal records, comparing what the HOA claimed had been done to what the city had actually approved, and the gaps were impossible to ignore once they were visible. Over the years, the office had grown, not dramatically, but incrementally. A wall added here, a room repurposed there, accessibility features modified without corresponding inspections, and each change justified internally as minor enough to bypass oversight, creating a cumulative violation that had never been tested simply because no one had bothered to test it. Meanwhile, the association's pressure campaign intensified, notices posted publicly, language inserted into newsletters about maintaining standards, subtle reminders that noncompliance carried consequences, and I watched as the neighborhood absorbed the message, not out of agreement, but out of habit, because fear, once institutionalized, becomes routine. Neighbors who had once waved now looked uncertain, not hostile, but cautious, as if proximity itself might be interpreted as complicity, And I understood then how effectively the HOA had trained the community to self-regulate through social discomfort rather than policy. The fine remained unpaid, not because I couldn't pay it, but because paying would have validated a process that deserved scrutiny, and each passing day without resolution seemed to frustrate the association more, prompting them to accelerate their own timeline without realizing they were doing so on unstable ground. I reached out not to the HOA, but to the city requesting information in the most neutral language possible, asking about inspection records, permit histories, and compliance standards for administrative structures, and the responses, when they came, were revealing not for what they said, but for what they omitted. There was no hostility, no defensiveness, just confusion, polite requests for clarification, acknowledgments that certain records were incomplete, and that absence spoke louder than any accusation could have. It became clear that the HOA's office existed in a regulatory gray area that had gone unchallenged for years, shielded by the assumption that community governance implied legitimacy, an assumption that regulators rarely questioned unless given a reason to do so. As I gathered documentation, the association made its next move, scheduling a compliance hearing, a formal meeting designed to appear fair while reinforcing predetermined outcomes, and the notice arrived with an air of finality, listing potential penalties, enforcement actions, and the expectation of immediate corrective measures. Still, no evidence was provided, no explanation of the alleged construction, just the same vague references repeated with increasing confidence, as if repetition itself could substitute for substance. The irony was almost unbearable that an organization so meticulous about appearances had grown careless with foundations, and I realized that this imbalance was not accidental. It was cultural, a belief that authority flowed in one direction only, outward, never inward, and that belief had shaped every decision they made. I prepared not for the hearing itself, but for what would follow it, organizing records, timelines, and correspondence into a narrative that didn't accuse but illuminated. Because the most effective reversals are not emotional, they are procedural, using the system's own language to expose its blind spots. The night before the hearing, another email arrived, this one less formal, more insistent, reminding me of the seriousness of the violation and the association's willingness to pursue all available remedies. And I could sense the frustration behind the words, the discomfort of authority being ignored, the anxiety that comes when control doesn't produce the expected response. What they didn't know was that their insistence had already triggered processes beyond their influence, that by escalating prematurely, they had invited scrutiny they could not manage internally, and that the office they relied on as a symbol of order had become the weakest link in their chain. The hearing itself would come, and it would be uneventful on the surface, procedural language exchanged, decisions deferred, but beneath that calm exterior, momentum had shifted, quietly but decisively, toward a reckoning that would not focus on alleged construction on my property, but on the very structure from which the accusations had been launched. And as the night settled in, the realization took hold that the association's greatest mistake was not overreaching, but assuming that no one would ever look closely enough to notice where its authority actually stood, a miscalculation that would soon become impossible to ignore. The compliance hearing came and went exactly as expected, which was to say it accomplished nothing on the surface while accelerating everything underneath, a carefully staged performance of authority that relied more on atmosphere than substance. And as I left that room, I understood with complete clarity that the HOA had no intention of proving anything because proof was never part of their strategy. The meeting itself unfolded in a sterile space filled with framed mission statements and laminated rules, the kind of environment designed to make residents feel small before any words were even exchanged. And throughout it all, the accusation of unauthorized construction floated unchallenged, repeated without definition, reinforced by nods and procedural language that treated assumption as fact. No diagrams were shown, no measurements referenced, no timelines established, just the same claim recycled until it sounded official through repetition alone, and that repetition revealed something important, a dependence on compliance rather than correctness. When the hearing ended without resolution, the association framed it as generosity, granting additional time to remedy violations that still hadn't been identified, and that framing was intentional, designed to place the burden of action entirely on me while preserving their image as reasonable enforcers. What they didn't realize was that the lack of specificity had now become a documented pattern, one that would matter far more outside their controlled environment than inside it. In the days that followed, I focused not on responding to the HOA, but on completing a parallel timeline, one that traced the association's own physical evolution from its earliest administrative footprint to its current configuration. And the deeper I went, the more evident it became that the office had quietly crossed regulatory thresholds it could no longer justify. The structure had started as a modest administrative space, approved under one classification, but over time it had been repurposed into something else entirely, hosting meetings, storing equipment, housing records, and accommodating staff in ways that exceeded its original designation. And each expansion, while small individually, accumulated into a material change that required oversight the HOA never sought. This wasn't negligence born of ignorance, it was confidence born of insulation, the belief that as a governing body, they existed above the scrutiny applied to individual homeowners, and that belief had shaped years of unchecked decisions. I submitted a formal request for inspection not as a complaint, but as a clarification, asking whether the office's current use aligned with its approved classification, and the response was telling in its neutrality, an acknowledgement that the question warranted review, that records would be examined, and that an inspection might be scheduled to verify compliance. From that moment on, the association's behavior shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Emails grew shorter, deadlines were reiterated without escalation, and the tone lost some of its confidence, replaced by something closer to impatience, as if they sensed movement but couldn't yet identify its source. Neighbors began whispering, not openly, but in fragments, speculation spreading through informal channels, the idea that the HOA was being challenged not through protest but through process, and that distinction mattered because process is harder to dismiss without exposing weaknesses. I watched as board members began appearing at the office more frequently, maintenance crews moving in and out at odd hours. Small adjustments made that suggested preparation rather than routine, and those movements confirmed what the documents had already suggested, that the association knew its position was less secure than it had projected. The fine remained unresolved, but its urgency diminished as attention shifted inward, toward damage control, and that shift created an imbalance the HOA struggled to manage, trying simultaneously to maintain pressure on me while reinforcing its own foundation. As the city scheduled a preliminary review, the association attempted to reassert control, issuing another notice that referenced potential liens and further penalties, language that felt increasingly performative rather than actionable, and it became clear that they were doubling down not because they were confident, but because retreat would signal vulnerability. The irony was that their insistence on enforcement had already triggered oversight that no amount of internal authority could override, and by the time they realized that, the process was no longer theirs to control. When confirmation arrived that an inspector would be visiting the office to assess compliance, it did so quietly, without drama, without accusation, just a standard notice that felt almost anticlimactic considering its implications. And yet that notice carried more weight than every fine and warning combined, because it represented external authority, one that operated independently of HOA narratives. The association attempted to downplay the visit, framing it as routine, assuring residents that nothing was wrong, that everything was in order, and that the inspection was merely procedural. But the timing of their reassurance betrayed anxiety, coming too quickly, too insistently, as if repetition could prevent consequences. I continued to remain silent publicly, not out of fear, but because silence had proven effective, allowing the HOA to reveal its priorities through action rather than rhetoric, and what they revealed was a fixation on image over compliance, a desire to appear in control even as that control slipped beyond reach. The days leading up to the inspection were marked by visible tension, board members convening behind closed doors, staff reorganizing spaces, documents being moved, signage adjusted, and the office itself undergoing cosmetic changes that suggested an attempt to align appearance with expectation rather than address structural reality. Those efforts, while understandable, came too late, because compliance is not a matter of presentation, it is a matter of alignment between approval and use, and that alignment had been broken for years. When the inspector arrived, There was no spectacle, no announcement, no crowd, just a professional presence conducting an assessment based on records, measurements, and classifications that existed outside the HOA's influence. And in that moment, the narrative shifted decisively away from alleged construction on my property and toward the association's own practices. The fine that had started everything now felt distant, almost irrelevant, overshadowed by questions the HOA could not answer without exposing inconsistencies. And as the inspection progressed, it became clear that the office itself, the symbolic heart of the association's authority, was now under scrutiny in a way it had never anticipated. The realization settled slowly but firmly that the HOA's greatest vulnerability was not resident resistance, but institutional complacency, the assumption that power insulated them from the same rules they enforced. And as the day ended, the atmosphere around the office felt altered, quieter, heavier, as if everyone involved understood that something fundamental had shifted, and that the next phase would not involve fines or hearings, but consequences that would redefine the balance of authority within the community, setting the stage for an outcome that no amount of internal messaging could contain. The preliminary findings did not arrive with spectacle, but their quiet finality changed everything, because once the HOA understood that the inspection was no longer exploratory but evaluative, their posture shifted from confidence to containment, a transition that revealed how unprepared they were for scrutiny that did not bend to internal narratives. The association attempted to seize control of the story immediately, circulating carefully worded updates that framed the inspection as routine and the findings as minor, emphasizing cooperation and progress while avoiding specifics. But the omission of detail only fueled speculation, and speculation spread faster than reassurance ever could. Residents began to connect dots they had never bothered to trace before, recalling years of aggressive enforcement, sudden fines, selective interpretations of rules, and the realization that the same standards had not been applied universally started to erode the aura of inevitability the HOA had cultivated. Internally, the board convened emergency meetings that stretched late into the evening, agendas rewritten mid-discussion, priorities shifting as members argued over whether transparency would mitigate fallout or accelerate it. And those disagreements leaked outward through subtle changes in behavior, inconsistent messaging, and visible strain among staff, who were now being asked to defend decisions they had never questioned. The office itself became a site of anxious activity, documents reorganized, signage adjusted, spaces repurposed hastily in an attempt to align current use with approved classifications. And those cosmetic changes underscored a misunderstanding of compliance, the belief that appearance could substitute for alignment, a belief that had worked internally for years but held no weight externally. As deadlines loomed, the HOA sought legal counsel, not to challenge the findings directly, but to explore options for delay, reinterpretation, or retroactive approval, strategies that depended on ambiguity and discretion rather than accountability, and each option carried risks they had not faced before. Meanwhile, the fine against me resurfaced in their communications, referenced as evidence of ongoing enforcement activity, an attempt to remind residents that authority still flowed outward. But the timing betrayed desperation, because the association needed a visible assertion of control even as its own compliance remained unresolved. I watched from a distance as neighbors began asking questions at meetings, not confrontational at first, but curious, probing inquiries about permits, classifications, and oversight that forced the board to answer in generalities rather than specifics. And those generalities began to sound hollow once residents realized how little transparency had been offered historically. The association responded by tightening its grip on procedure, limiting discussion, emphasizing decorum, and reminding attendees of time constraints, techniques designed to manage dissent without addressing substance. But the effect was the opposite, reinforcing the perception that the HOA preferred control over clarity. As the inspector's timeline progressed, additional requests were made for documentation that the association struggled to produce, not because it didn't exist entirely, but because it was fragmented, outdated, or inconsistent, reflecting years of incremental change managed internally without regard for external standards. Each request added pressure, not just administratively, but culturally, because it forced the HOA to confront the gap between how it perceived itself and how it was now being evaluated. The board's internal divisions widened, some members advocating for immediate corrective action even if it meant acknowledging fault publicly, others insisting that any admission would undermine authority permanently, and that stalemate slowed decision-making at the worst possible moment. Residents sensed the paralysis, and with it came a subtle shift in behavior, more people speaking up, fewer accepting explanations at face value. The collective realization forming that authority depended as much on legitimacy as it did on enforcement, and legitimacy was now being questioned. The association attempted to redirect attention by announcing new initiatives, community improvements, and enforcement campaigns, hoping to reassert relevance and control. But those announcements landed flat, overshadowed by unresolved questions about the office and its compliance. The irony deepened when notices about adherence to codes and standards were circulated even as the HOA itself struggled to meet them, and that contradiction did not go unnoticed. As weeks passed, the inspector's follow-up visit was scheduled, this time to assess progress and determine whether continued operation of the office was appropriate under existing conditions. And that scheduling introduced a level of consequence the HOA could no longer deflect with language. Preparations intensified, but the focus remained misaligned, prioritizing presentation over resolution. And in doing so, the association missed opportunities to address underlying issues that could have mitigated outcomes. The fine against me remained unpaid and unresolved, but it had become symbolic rather than actionable, a reminder of how the conflict had begun rather than a lever of control, and its presence in correspondence felt increasingly out of place against the backdrop of larger institutional concerns. As the follow-up approached, tension permeated the neighborhood, not through open conflict, but through anticipation, the sense that something definitive was about to happen that would alter the community's relationship with its governing body. When the inspector returned, the assessment was brief and focused, guided by criteria established during the initial review, and the findings were clear. The office's current use remained out of alignment with its approved classification. Corrective measures had not addressed the core issues, and continued operation under existing conditions was not permissible. That conclusion was delivered without emotion, without accusation, simply as a statement of fact, and it carried implications the HOA could no longer manage internally. The association was given a choice framed as procedure rather than punishment: cease certain operations until compliance could be achieved or face enforced closure, and that choice exposed the limits of their authority in stark terms. The board's response was fragmented, some members pushing for immediate compliance, others scrambling for alternatives, but the window for maneuvering had narrowed dramatically. News of the decision spread quickly, not through official channels at first, but through conversation, speculation giving way to confirmation, and with it came a collective reassessment of the HOA's role and reliability. Residents who had once viewed enforcement as inevitable began to see it as conditional, dependent on legitimacy that could be lost, and that shift marked a profound change in the community's dynamic. As the association prepared its official response, the realization set in that the story was no longer about an alleged violation on my property, but about the consequences of unchecked authority, and that whatever happened next would not be contained within meeting rooms or email threads, but would reshape the balance between governance and accountability in ways that could not be reversed, setting the stage for a reckoning that would bring the conflict to a decisive point in the chapters ahead. The moment the HOA realized that its options had narrowed to compliance or cessation, the atmosphere inside the neighborhood changed from tense anticipation to controlled panic, because authority that has never been challenged rarely develops contingency plans for failure, and now every decision carried consequences that could not be deferred with language alone. The association attempted to project calm, issuing an official update that framed the inspector's determination as a temporary administrative hurdle, assuring residents that leadership was working diligently toward resolution. But the phrasing betrayed uncertainty, careful words chosen not to inform, but to soothe. And that distinction mattered because it signaled that the board no longer believed certainty was possible. Behind closed doors, the discussions were less composed, dominated by competing priorities that revealed how fragile the HOA's unity had become. Some members arguing that immediate suspension of office operations would demonstrate responsibility and protect long-term legitimacy, others insisting that closure would embolden residents and undermine enforcement authority irreparably. And that divide reflected a deeper disagreement about what the association actually existed to do. For years, enforcement had been treated as an end in itself, a demonstration of relevance and control, and now that enforcement was threatened by noncompliance, the board struggled to reconcile its identity with reality. The fine against me resurfaced again in these discussions, not as a viable enforcement action, but as a symbol, a reminder of the narrative the HOA had attempted to construct, one where residents violated and the association corrected, and that narrative no longer held up under scrutiny. Attempts were made to revive it. Drafts circulated proposing renewed enforcement campaigns, reminders of standards, even suggestions of increasing fines to reassert authority. But those ideas were ultimately shelved as impractical, because enforcing rules while failing to meet them would only accelerate loss of credibility. Meanwhile, residents began to test boundaries in small but noticeable ways, questioning notices, requesting documentation, pushing back on minor citations that they might previously have accepted without comment, and each challenge, however polite, further strained an association unaccustomed to justification. The office itself became increasingly quiet, its usual rhythm disrupted as staff adjusted schedules, meetings were postponed or moved online, and the physical space that had once symbolized order now felt provisional, its future uncertain, its presence contested. As the deadline for compliance approached, the HOA sought extensions, submitting requests that emphasized intent rather than outcome, progress rather than alignment. But the inspectors' responses remained measured and firm, reiterating requirements without negotiation, reinforcing that compliance was not a matter of effort but of result. That distinction proved difficult for the board to accept, because it stripped away the flexibility they had relied on internally, forcing them to confront standards that did not bend to perception or intention. In the neighborhood, conversations grew more open, neighbors comparing experiences, sharing stories of fines, warnings, and arbitrary enforcement that now felt less isolated and more systemic, and that collective awareness changed the social landscape in subtle but significant ways. Where once silence had been the default response to HOA action, curiosity and skepticism began to take its place, and with them came a willingness to question authority that had previously seemed unassailable. I remained publicly disengaged, not out of indifference, but because the situation no longer required my involvement to progress, and that absence became its own statement, reinforcing that the conflict had evolved beyond an individual dispute. The fine still existed on paper, but it had lost its power to intimidate, overshadowed by the association's struggle to justify its own operations, and that reversal was not lost on anyone paying attention. As the compliance deadline passed without resolution, the inspector issued a formal notice outlining required actions and consequences for noncompliance, language that left little room for interpretation, and the HOA was forced to acknowledge publicly that certain operations would be suspended pending corrective measures. That acknowledgement marked a turning point, the first time the association admitted limitation rather than authority, and the impact was immediate, residents reacting with a mix of relief, concern, and vindication, emotions that reflected years of suppressed frustration finding an outlet. The board attempted to frame the suspension as strategic, a proactive step toward improvement, but the distinction between strategy and necessity was clear, and the effort to control the narrative felt increasingly strained. Internally, the association began reallocating resources, diverting funds previously earmarked for enforcement toward compliance efforts, consulting professionals, commissioning assessments, and confronting the financial implications of years of incremental noncompliance that could no longer be ignored. Those implications were sobering, revealing how deeply the assumption of exemption had shaped budgeting and planning, and how costly it would be to undo. As operations slowed, the HOA's presence in daily neighborhood life diminished. Fewer notices, fewer inspections, fewer reminders, and that absence allowed residents to experience the community without constant oversight, an experience that many found unexpectedly liberating. The contrast highlighted how much of the HOA's influence had been sustained not through necessity but through habit, and once that habit was disrupted, its hold weakened rapidly. The board's internal conflicts intensified as accountability became unavoidable. Some members resigning quietly, others doubling down on rhetoric that blamed external interference for internal failures, and those fractures further undermined cohesion at a moment when unity was most needed. Throughout it all, the fine against me remained unresolved, a relic of an earlier phase of the conflict, occasionally mentioned but increasingly irrelevant, and its persistence served only to remind residents of how the situation had begun, not how it now stood. As weeks passed, the association's authority continued to erode, not through dramatic collapse, but through attrition, each unanswered question, each delayed response, each suspended operation contributing to a gradual but unmistakable shift in power. By the time the HOA formally announced the temporary closure of its office pending compliance, the decision felt less like a shock and more like an acknowledgement of reality, and the community received it with a mix of resignation and resolve. The closure was framed as temporary corrective necessary for the long-term health of the association, but beneath that language lay an unspoken truth: that authority once lost is difficult to reclaim, and that the association would not emerge unchanged. As the office doors closed and operations moved into limbo, the neighborhood entered a new phase, one where governance was no longer assumed but questioned, where enforcement was no longer inevitable but conditional, and where the story that began with a $7,500 fine had evolved into a broader reckoning with power, accountability, and the consequences of believing that rules exist only for others. Setting the stage for a resolution that would extend far beyond a single property or a single violation. With the office closed and the HOA's authority displaced into a patchwork of emails, temporary meeting links, and delayed responses, the neighborhood entered an unfamiliar quiet that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a structural shift. Because systems built on constant enforcement rarely adapt smoothly to absence. The association attempted to reassert presence digitally, sending updates that emphasized continuity and reassurance. But the effect was diluted, authority rendered abstract without a physical center, and residents began to notice how much of the HOA's influence had depended on proximity and routine rather than legitimacy. Without the office as a hub, the cadence of governance faltered, response times stretched, decisions deferred, and the mechanisms that once produced swift consequences now produced ambiguity, and ambiguity invited scrutiny. In that space, questions multiplied, not just about the office or the inspection, but about everything the HOA had done for years without explanation: budgets, reserves, enforcement priorities, and the rationale behind selective rigor, and each unanswered inquiry further eroded confidence. The board attempted to consolidate control by narrowing communication channels, centralizing responses, and limiting access to information under the guise of efficiency. But those efforts backfired, reinforcing the perception that transparency was conditional rather than principled. Residents began organizing informally, sharing documents, comparing notices, mapping timelines, and in doing so, they discovered patterns that had been invisible when viewed in isolation. Enforcement clusters around certain properties, fines issued without follow-up, warnings that escalated inconsistently, and the realization took hold that the HOA's actions had been guided less by standards and more by convenience. As this collective awareness grew, the fine against me resurfaced not as a threat, but as a reference point, the catalyst that had exposed vulnerabilities the association could no longer conceal, and its unresolved status became emblematic of a system stuck between assertion and accountability. The board, sensing its diminishing influence, sought to accelerate compliance efforts, commissioning assessments, drafting plans, and proposing timelines that promised resolution. But each plan required funding that had previously been allocated to enforcement and amenities, and reallocating those resources forced uncomfortable conversations about priorities and past decisions. The financial strain revealed another layer of miscalculation: the assumption that authority could generate revenue without reciprocal investment in compliance, and undoing that assumption proved costly. As consultants evaluated the office's path to compliance, their findings underscored what the inspection had already implied: that bringing the structure into alignment would require not just minor adjustments, but fundamental changes to how the HOA operated, changes that challenged its self-image as an efficient, rule-driven organization. Some board members embraced this reckoning, arguing that reform was an opportunity to rebuild legitimacy, while others resisted, framing the situation as an external attack that threatened the association's autonomy, and that ideological divide deepened fractures that had been forming for months. The neighborhood, once passive, now watched these dynamics unfold with growing confidence. Residents attending virtual meetings in greater numbers, asking pointed questions, requesting documentation, and refusing to accept vague assurances as sufficient. And each instance of pushback normalized dissent in a space where dissent had long been discouraged. The association's attempts to manage this shift through procedure, time limits, and agenda control felt increasingly performative, unable to suppress a momentum driven by shared experience rather than isolated frustration. Meanwhile, the inspector's role continued quietly in the background, reviewing progress, clarifying requirements, and maintaining a steady timeline that did not accommodate internal debate, and that external consistency contrasted sharply with the HOA's internal volatility. As deadlines approached, it became clear that compliance would not be achieved quickly, and that extended suspension of office operations was likely, a prospect that unsettled the board because it implied a prolonged period without the physical embodiment of their authority. The fine against me, still unresolved, became a liability in this context, a reminder of overreach that undermined claims of good faith, and discussions emerged about whether to rescind it quietly to reduce exposure, though such a move risked admitting fault. That hesitation illustrated the HOA's predicament, caught between the desire to minimize consequences and the fear of setting a precedent that residents might interpret as weakness. As weeks turned into months, the absence of routine enforcement altered daily life in subtle but meaningful ways, residents reporting fewer inspections, fewer warnings, fewer confrontations, and discovering that the neighborhood did not descend into disorder as predicted. Lawns remained trimmed, homes maintained. The feared chaos never materialized, and that empirical evidence challenged the narrative that strict enforcement was necessary for stability. The association's warnings about declining standards rang hollow against lived experience, and residents began to question whether the HOA's approach had ever been about maintenance rather than control. Internally, the board faced mounting pressure to adapt, resignations increasing as the burden of accountability grew, vacancies filled reluctantly, leadership reshuffled without clear direction, and those changes further destabilized operations at a critical moment. The inspector issued additional guidance, reiterating that continued noncompliance would trigger more definitive action, language that underscored the narrowing window for resolution, and the board was forced to confront the possibility that the office might not reopen in its current form at all. That prospect reframed discussions entirely, shifting focus from repair to reimagining governance, a concept that unsettled those invested in the status quo. Throughout it all, the community's perception of authority continued to evolve, residents no longer assuming enforcement was inevitable, but evaluating it against principles of fairness and legitimacy, and that cultural shift proved irreversible. The fine against me, once intended as a deterrent, now served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that asserting power without accountability can trigger consequences far beyond the initial target. As the HOA struggled to reconcile its identity with reality, the neighborhood moved closer to a turning point, one where governance would be redefined not by fear or habit, but by consent and transparency. And as the chapter closed, it became evident that the association's future depended not on restoring its old authority, but on earning a new one, a challenge far more complex than issuing fines or enforcing rules, and one that would determine whether the HOA could adapt or continue to unravel in the chapters ahead. By the time the HOA acknowledged publicly that the office would remain closed indefinitely pending full compliance, the announcement felt less like news and more like confirmation of what the neighborhood had already internalized, that the association's authority had shifted from assumed to conditional, and that shift carried consequences no policy manual had prepared them for. Without a physical headquarters, the HOA's presence became fragmented, its communications inconsistent, its enforcement uneven, and residents began to experience governance as optional rather than omnipresent, a subtle but powerful change that altered expectations on both sides. The board attempted to stabilize operations through virtual meetings and interim committees, but the absence of a central space exposed deeper structural weaknesses, reliance on a few key individuals, informal processes masquerading as policy, and a lack of documented accountability that had gone unnoticed when authority flowed uninterrupted. As these gaps became visible, residents grew bolder, not confrontational but deliberate, requesting records, asking for rationales, questioning precedents, and insisting on timelines, behaviors that would have been unthinkable months earlier, but now felt appropriate in a system struggling to justify itself. The fine against me surfaced again during this period, not as an enforcement action, but as a liability, a topic that board members circled without resolution, aware that pursuing it would invite scrutiny they could not afford, yet rescinding it would acknowledge error, and that paralysis reflected a broader inability to adapt to a reality where authority required explanation. Financial pressures mounted as compliance costs escalated, consultants, invoices accumulated, and reserves once earmarked for expansion or amenities were redirected toward remediation, and those reallocations prompted difficult questions from residents about past spending decisions, questions the board answered defensively rather than transparently, further eroding trust. The association's attempts to frame the situation as temporary met resistance not through protest, but through patience, residents waiting for actions rather than assurances, and that patience proved more destabilizing than outrage ever could have been. As months passed, informal leadership began to emerge within the community, neighbors organizing information sessions, sharing updates, and creating channels of communication independent of the HOA. And while these efforts were framed as collaborative rather than oppositional, they highlighted how much the association's role had depended on exclusivity rather than service. The board viewed these developments with unease, perceiving them as challenges to its relevance, yet lacking the leverage to suppress them without further damaging credibility. The inspector's continued involvement remained steady and impersonal, periodic check-ins reinforcing that compliance was not a negotiation but a requirement, and each interaction underscored the contrast between external accountability and internal resistance. As remediation plans stalled, it became increasingly clear that reopening the office in its previous form would require concessions the HOA was reluctant to make, changes to classification, limitations on use, and restructuring of operations that would reduce centralized control. And those implications sparked renewed debate within the board about the future of the association itself. Some members advocated for embracing reform, viewing the crisis as an opportunity to reset priorities and rebuild trust, while others clung to the belief that authority, once compromised, must be restored aggressively to prevent erosion, and that ideological divide deepened fractures that had already weakened cohesion. Residents sensed the discord and adjusted their expectations accordingly, no longer looking to the HOA for decisive leadership, but managing issues collaboratively where possible, and that adaptation reduced reliance on enforcement mechanisms that had once seemed indispensable. The fine against me, still unresolved, became a symbol discussed openly among residents, not as a grievance, but as evidence of how easily power could be misapplied when unchecked, and its persistence without action highlighted the board's inability to reconcile past behavior with present constraints. As pressure mounted, a proposal emerged to formally review and potentially rescind disputed enforcement actions issued during the period of noncompliance, a move that would address immediate concerns but risked opening the door to broader challenges, and the board hesitated, aware that acknowledging error could invite claims they were unprepared to address. That hesitation prolonged uncertainty, and uncertainty continued to drain authority, each day without resolution reinforcing the perception that the HOA was reacting rather than leading. Meanwhile, the community's day-to-day life continued largely uninterrupted, maintenance performed voluntarily, disputes resolved informally, and the absence of strict oversight revealed a capacity for self-regulation that contradicted long-standing narratives about the necessity of rigid enforcement. This lived experience undermined the HOA's core justification, forcing a reevaluation of its purpose that extended beyond the office or the inspection and into the philosophy of governance itself. As the chapter closed, the association stood at a crossroads, facing a choice between transformation and obsolescence, while residents, once subjects of enforcement, had become stakeholders in determining what governance would look like going forward, and the fine that had started everything lingered unresolved, a reminder that the next move would not simply settle a dispute. but would define whether authority in the neighborhood would be rebuilt on accountability or continue to unravel under the weight of its own assumptions, setting the stage for a confrontation that would finally force a decision neither side could avoid. The turning point did not come with an announcement or a confrontation, but with a shift in tone so subtle that it took time to recognize its significance. Because authority rarely collapses all at once, it erodes through decisions deferred and responsibilities avoided until the structure supporting it can no longer bear its own weight. The HOA's communications began to sound different, less declarative, more conditional, language softened with qualifiers and timelines replaced with intentions, and that linguistic change reflected a deeper uncertainty about what the association could still enforce without inviting challenge. Residents noticed immediately, not because they were looking for weakness, but because they had grown accustomed to certainty delivered without explanation, and now that certainty was gone. The board attempted to regain footing by proposing a comprehensive review of policies, framing it as modernization rather than concession, but the proposal lacked specificity, no deadlines, no scope, no acknowledgement of past missteps, and without those elements, it felt less like reform and more like delay. As weeks passed, the unresolved fine against me became increasingly untenable, referenced quietly in board discussions as an unresolved risk rather than an enforcement action, and its continued existence created a contradiction the association could no longer rationalize, because pursuing it would invite scrutiny into the very compliance failures they were struggling to resolve, while rescinding it would require admitting that the original accusation lacked foundation. That contradiction reached a breaking point when residents began requesting formal explanations for outstanding enforcement actions issued during the period of noncompliance, framing their inquiries not as complaints, but as due diligence, and those requests forced the board to confront a reality it had avoided: that enforcement without legitimacy could not be sustained. Internally, discussions grew more urgent, consultants advising that unresolved disputes increased exposure, that transparency might mitigate long-term risk, and that selective enforcement could no longer be defended under scrutiny. But the board remained divided, some members viewing transparency as surrender, others recognizing it as the only path forward. As this debate unfolded, the inspector issued an updated assessment reiterating that compliance efforts remained incomplete, and that continued suspension of office operations would persist until substantive changes were implemented, language that left little room for interpretation and underscored the permanence of the current state. That assessment stripped away any remaining illusion that time alone would resolve the situation, forcing the association to choose between action and stagnation. The community's response to this prolonged uncertainty was not anger, but adaptation, neighbors organizing shared resources, coordinating maintenance, and resolving minor disputes collectively, demonstrating a resilience that challenged the HOA's foundational narrative about the necessity of centralized control. This organic self-governance did not replace the HOA, but it diminished reliance on it, and that diminished reliance translated into diminished authority, a feedback loop the board struggled to interrupt. As participation in virtual meetings declined, not from apathy but from frustration with circular discussions, the board faced the prospect of irrelevance, its decisions increasingly disconnected from lived experience. The fine against me surfaced again in this context, discussed openly among residents as a case study rather than a grievance, and its unresolved status became emblematic of the HOA's paralysis, a reminder that authority unused or misused erodes faster than authority challenged directly. Eventually, a motion was introduced to formally review disputed enforcement actions, including mine, and while the motion did not guarantee rescission, it acknowledged uncertainty, a significant departure from the board's earlier insistence on infallibility. The debate surrounding the motion was restrained but revealing, arguments framed around fairness, precedent, and risk, rather than power, signaling a shift in priorities driven by necessity rather than conviction. When the motion passed narrowly, it marked the first official acknowledgement that the HOA's enforcement practices might warrant reassessment, and that acknowledgement reverberated through the community, reinforcing the sense that accountability was no longer theoretical. The review process moved slowly, constrained by incomplete records and conflicting interpretations, but its very existence altered dynamics. residents submitting documentation, timelines reconstructed, and patterns of enforcement scrutinized in ways that would have been inconceivable before the inspection. As my fine came under review, the absence of evidence became impossible to ignore. No permits violated, no construction identified, no documentation supporting the original claim, and that void highlighted how easily authority had been exercised without justification. The board's response to these findings was cautious, acknowledging gaps without assigning blame. But the implication was clear, that the fine had been issued not on the basis of compliance, but on assumption. This realization did not resolve the broader compliance issues facing the HOA, but it crystallized the lesson residents had already learned, that governance without accountability invites misuse, and misuse invites consequences that extend far beyond the initial act. As the chapter drew to a close, the association stood on the brink of a decision that would define its future, whether to confront its failures openly and rebuild on a foundation of transparency, or continue to defer, risking further erosion of legitimacy until external forces rendered the choice moot. And the community, having experienced life without constant enforcement, waited not with fear, but with clarity, aware now that authority derives not from fines or offices, but from trust earned and maintained, setting the stage for a resolution that would finally bring the story full circle in the chapters to come. The review process, once initiated, became a mirror the HOA could no longer look away from, reflecting not only the absence of evidence behind specific enforcement actions, but the deeper habits that had allowed those actions to occur unchecked for so long. And as documents were examined and timelines reconstructed, the association found itself confronting patterns it had never intended to see. What began as a narrow assessment of disputed fines expanded organically, because each unanswered question led to another, and each clarification exposed inconsistencies that could not be dismissed as isolated mistakes. Residents who participated in the review did so with a measured calm, not driven by revenge or spectacle, but by a shared understanding that the moment demanded precision rather than outrage, and that restraint made the findings harder to ignore. The fine against me, stripped of its initial framing, stood exposed as a procedural assertion unsupported by facts. No permit requirement violated, no construction identified, no inspection record corroborating the claim, and that exposure shifted the discussion from whether the fine should be enforced to how it had been issued at all. Board members who had once defended the association's actions found themselves recalibrating their language, acknowledging uncertainty where certainty had once been automatic. And that linguistic shift signaled an internal reckoning that extended beyond a single case. The inspector's continued oversight reinforced this recalibration, reminding the HOA that accountability was not a temporary inconvenience but an ongoing condition, and that unresolved disputes complicated compliance efforts by undermining claims of good faith. As the review progressed, additional cases surfaced, not identical but similar in structure, fines issued with minimal documentation, warnings escalated without follow-up, enforcement applied unevenly across properties, and while each case differed in detail, together they formed a narrative of authority exercised through assumption rather than verification. This accumulation of evidence did not provoke panic, but it did provoke resignation, a growing acceptance among board members that the association's practices would need to change fundamentally if legitimacy were to be restored. Financial implications loomed large as well, the possibility of refunds, waived fines, and legal exposure forcing conversations about reserves, insurance, and future budgeting that had been postponed for years under the assumption that enforcement actions would go unchallenged. Those conversations were uncomfortable, but they grounded the abstract concept of accountability in concrete consequences, reinforcing that decisions made casually could carry lasting costs. The community observed these developments with cautious optimism, aware that acknowledgement alone did not guarantee reform, but also recognizing that acknowledgement was a prerequisite for any meaningful change. Virtual meetings grew more substantive as agendas shifted away from enforcement updates toward policy review, compliance planning, and governance structure. And while attendance fluctuated, the tone was markedly different, less adversarial, more analytical, reflecting a collective interest in outcomes rather than authority. The unresolved status of the office remained a constant backdrop, a reminder that the association's own compliance failures continued to constrain its options, and that any attempt to reassert control without addressing those failures would ring hollow. As the review committee prepared its recommendations, it did so with an awareness of the broader context, that rescinding fines without addressing systemic issues would offer temporary relief but leave underlying vulnerabilities intact, and that comprehensive reform would require concessions the HOA had historically resisted. When the recommendations were presented, they were framed not as indictments, but as corrections, proposals to void unsupported enforcement actions, revise procedures to require documented verification, and establish independent oversight mechanisms to prevent recurrence. And while these proposals did not erase the past, they offered a path forward grounded in accountability rather than authority. The board's response to these recommendations was cautious but receptive, a marked departure from earlier defensiveness, driven less by conviction than by necessity, because the alternative, continued resistance, risked further erosion of trust and potential external intervention. As discussions unfolded, the fine against me was addressed directly, the lack of evidence acknowledged, and the decision to rescind it framed as a corrective measure rather than an admission of wrongdoing, a distinction that mattered symbolically even if it changed little materially. That decision, once finalized, sent a ripple through the community, not because of the amount involved, but because it represented a tangible shift from assertion to accountability, a recognition that enforcement without foundation could not stand. Yet even as that chapter closed, the broader implications remained unresolved. The office still closed, compliance incomplete, and the association's future uncertain. And it became clear that rescinding fines was not an endpoint but a beginning, a necessary step toward rebuilding legitimacy that would require sustained effort and transparency. As the board moved to implement initial reforms, resistance persisted among some members and residents alike, skepticism rooted in years of experience that cautioned against optimism, and that skepticism ensured that the HOA's actions would be scrutinized closely rather than accepted at face value. The inspector's role continued to anchor this scrutiny externally, reinforcing that reform would be measured not by intention, but by outcome, and that compliance would be verified rather than assumed. As the chapter drew to a close, the neighborhood existed in a state of cautious transition, old narratives about authority giving way to new conversations about governance, participation, and trust. And the story that began with a $7,500 fine had evolved into a broader examination of power exercised without accountability, setting the stage for a final chapter in which the HOA would have to demonstrate, not declare, whether it could adapt to a reality where authority was earned rather than imposed. The resolution did not arrive as a dramatic victory or a humiliating collapse, but as a measured reckoning that felt more permanent precisely because it was quiet, procedural, and unavoidable, the kind of ending that reshapes systems rather than headlines. With the fine formally rescinded and the review committee's recommendations adopted, the HOA entered a phase it had never experienced before, one defined not by enforcement metrics but by verification, transparency, and external accountability. And that shift forced a reevaluation of nearly every practice that had once been taken for granted. The office remained closed longer than anyone initially expected, compliance efforts expanding in scope as inspectors identified additional requirements tied to classification, accessibility, and operational use. And the association was compelled to accept that reopening would not restore its former authority unless the structure itself aligned fully with regulations it had ignored for years. Financial realities followed quickly, reserves strained, budgets rewritten, amenities deferred, and the cost of remediation made visible to residents who had previously seen only fines and dues, and that visibility altered expectations permanently, transforming abstract governance into tangible responsibility. Board leadership continued to change, resignations giving way to new appointments selected less for assertiveness than for credibility, individuals willing to operate under scrutiny rather than behind procedure. And while not all residents trusted the transformation immediately, the shift in tone was unmistakable. Meetings became less frequent but more substantive. Agendas focused on compliance milestones, oversight mechanisms, and clearly documented processes. And the absence of performative enforcement created space for genuine discussion about what the HOA should exist to do rather than what it had done by default. The neighborhood adapted to this new reality with surprising ease. Routines established during the office closure persisting, neighbors coordinating voluntarily, disputes resolved informally, and the realization settling in that community cohesion did not require constant surveillance, a lesson that fundamentally challenged the association's historic justification. When the inspector finally approved a limited reopening of the office under revised conditions, the event passed without ceremony, no celebration, no declarations, just a return to operation framed explicitly by constraints and oversight. And that framing mattered because it reinforced that authority would now be conditional rather than assumed. The HOA's communications reflected this recalibration, language precise, commitments documented, enforcement actions tied explicitly to verified violations. And while this approach lacked the immediacy and intimidation of the past, it carried a legitimacy that had long been absent. Residents responded cautiously but constructively, engagement driven not by fear but by interest, participation measured rather than reactive, and the relationship between the community and its governing body began to resemble collaboration rather than compliance. The story of the $7,500 fine lingered as a reference point, retold not with bitterness but with clarity, a reminder of how easily power can overextend when unchecked, and how consequences can cascade in unexpected directions when accountability enters the picture. For the HOA, the lesson was costly but instructive, that enforcing rules without adhering to them invites scrutiny that cannot be managed internally, and that legitimacy once lost must be rebuilt through action rather than assertion. For the community, the outcome was equally instructive, revealing that governance structures are not immutable, that authority can be questioned without chaos, and that transparency, once demanded, reshapes expectations permanently. As daily life settled into a new equilibrium, the neighborhood no longer defined itself by the presence or absence of enforcement, but by a shared understanding of standards grounded in fairness rather than fear, and that cultural shift proved more enduring than any fine or policy change. The chapter closed not with triumph, but with transformation. The HOA diminished in its unchecked power yet strengthened in its accountability. Residents empowered not by rebellion but by participation, and the conflict that began with an unfounded accusation ending as a recalibration of authority itself. A reminder that when institutions forget the rules apply to them as well, the system eventually responds, not with outrage, but with consequence, and that consequence, once felt, changes everything that follows.